Welcome to The Presumption, everyone. I'm Sara Azari, and I'm here with my partner in crime, Jimmy G. Hi, Jim.
Hey, Sara, how are you?
Good, good. And today we're joined by a really good friend, a stellar colleague and lawyer who I don't get to see enough of, Dean Masserman. Welcome, Dean, to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So a little bit about Dean. What he does is such a niche sort of practice. You know, he specializes in art law. And by that, you know, we're not talking about fine art. We're talking about artificial reproductive technology, basically all processes wherein eggs and embryos are handled. So examples are surrogacy, egg donation, reproductive transactional law and litigation, which he's done since 1994. And presently, Dean is recognized worldwide as the foremost expert in the art field. He secured the first pre-birth order, PBO, of parentage in the United States following the landmark decision in Buzanka versus Buzanka, which has since become the protocol in almost every state. Dean later co-authored California Assembly Bill 1217, which codified PBOs and established the current California surrogacy laws, California Family Code Section 7960. Most Western states, including Nevada, Washington, Oregon, and Colorado, modeled their state laws after the California statutes. At present, Dean's primary focus is in cutting-edge areas of the law related to reproductive negligence, cryotank failure, use and disposition of frozen embryos and genetic tissue. So before we go on, I'm going to just briefly give an overview of what we're talking about today. It's interesting that we're talking about all of this today, you guys, because apparently the Florida 6-week abortion ban went into effect today. And it really matters to all of us, abortion, reproductive rights, all of it. This is election year, and I don't know, I think Dean's going to have some different views about the laws around this. But so what we're discussing today is essentially control over the woman's body, the right to abort, and the right to reproduce in America. Pretty important stuff, whether you're male, female, gay, straight, young, old. And I just can't think of a better guest to talk about all this with us than Dean. So we'll start with the Alabama Supreme Court decision that came out in February. So I'll start with Dean, and then we'll go to Jim for the abortion stuff, because Jim, aside from being a pro-criminal defense attorney, is also counsel to OBGYNs in a hospital group that have legal exposure concerns around performing abortion where they think it's medically necessary around that decision, essentially. So starting with Dean. Dean, the Alabama Supreme Court ruled in February that frozen embryos are unborn children, calling IVFs the Wild West treatment of embryos. What is your reaction to that?
Well, visceral. My reaction is it's not the Wild West anymore. When I started in 94, that was the Wild West. There wasn't a single state that had a codified law regarding IVF procedures, the disposition of embryos. That was Wild West times. We just would find a judge and convince the judge to do what we need the judge to do. Nowadays, I think it's well established. The medical technology is well established. The legal parameters by which you finalize parental rights is firmly established. This is really just a backdoor attack by religious extremists who have always been in favor of overturning Roe, in favor of ending IVF and abortion, because it's really, at the time, was a backdoor to Roe. Now that you have the Dobbs decision, which I've been telling people for years, they're going to use IVF, they're going to use embryos, they're going to use surrogacy as a backdoor to attack abortion rights. But now that they've got that solidified across, at least by the Supreme Court, now they're just going after the embryos, which is largely funded by not just religious extremists, but by the Catholic Church. A lot of the cases that I've litigated are literally funded or paid for on the legal side by the archdiocese. So it's just a strategic attack. If you read the opinion in the Alabama case, it's like reading scripture.
Right. So, yeah. And so, by the way, just for our viewers, Dobbs is the Supreme Court decision that overruled Roe v. Wade, that Dean is referring to. And yes, that Alabama decision is like a scripture. Word Christ and God is like all over it. I remember I read it in February and I was so shocked. And then I went on the air with, the pro-life people, who were just, they were just determined that this is some form of mass murder. But Dean, in Alabama, this statute that was litigated, it was a wrongful death statute that applies to minors. And so the idea was that a minor who's wrongfully killed, the location of that minor is irrelevant. They could be in the uterus, they could be outside the uterus. So what do you say to people who say, well, this is just in Alabama? We don't care about that.
Well, technically, from a business standpoint here in California, it is just in Alabama. And on one level, I don't care about it. It doesn't impact me. But I try to advocate on a national basis, because God forbid someone takes a case to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court says that there is such a thing as fetal personhood or juridical, I think that's the word they use in Louisiana, persons. So, and actually that brings up an interesting point. Louisiana in 1986 determined that embryos were juridical persons, meaning that they had rights to a lawyer, right to exist. So we don't do IVF or surrogacy in Louisiana. We stay as far away from Louisiana as possible. Has it impacted surrogacy nationwide? No, which just means Louisiana is a no-go zone. And now, to a great extent, Alabama is a no-go zone. In fact, most states that have, implemented strict abortion bans are a no-go zone.
You said that South Carolina is a no-go zone for you too, right?
I think South Carolina has a 6-week abortion ban in place now. Tell me if I'm wrong, Jim. I don't know, but that's what I think.
Well, you are not totally wrong. We don't have a timeline. We have a heartbeat. If you can detect a heartbeat in an ultrasound, and you're required to perform an ultrasound before you ever do any type of abortion or termination procedure, and if you detect a heartbeat, then you cannot perform the termination unless one of the exceptions applies. But
that's a 6-week abortion ban, because we confirm that the surrogates are pregnant around 6 weeks by fetal heartbeat. So that's a 6-week effectively.
Yeah. Well, sure, it's effectively, but it could be 5.5 weeks.
It could be.
Right.
It could be 7, but basically it's around 6 weeks on average. I consider that a 6-week.
The point is that, most women don't know they're pregnant
until you have a fetal heartbeat.
Yeah, right. So you can put however number of weeks on it, but in essence, in practicality, it's like a straight up ban.
So Dean, let's go back to Alabama, and will you just dumb it down for me and listeners so that
me?
yeah. So
I'm really good at dumbing things down. That's great.
Yeah. So what was the earth-shattering ruling coming out of the Supreme Court of Alabama?
Well, from an industry standpoint, if embryos are people, or where do you draw that line? What if a doctor, you still have humans in labs, we have some AI, but basically you have human error. If someone spikes the temperature in a cryo tank and all those embryos deceased, is that a mass murder? If someone drops a straw on the ground and the embryo is destroyed, is that a manslaughter? What happens, and I litigate this a lot. What happens when people get divorced? What's the implication of an Alabama Supreme Court ruling that says embryos are people? Are you going to have custody disputes over those embryos? Right now, in the divorce cases that I litigate, we have leftover frozen embryos in a tank somewhere in a clinic. One spouse typically wants to use them, and it's usually the woman, because a woman has a much smaller reproductive fertility window than a man. Men can produce viable sperm well into their 60s. Women are, statistically considered infertile at about 42. So oftentimes the woman says, "This is my last chance to have a biological child," and the husband is like, "F off, we're getting a divorce. I hate you. I'm not having any more kids with you." And then we get into this dispute about who's going to get those embryos and what can they do with them. If the wife's allowed to use them, is he being forced into becoming a parent against his will? If she's denied the right to use them, is she being denied her constitutional right to bear children? It's a big issue.
And so, as I understand it, also, I mean, the Alabama Supreme Court said that embryo is a person for purposes of this wrongful death statute. And then when you harvest embryos for, in vitro fertilization, I mean, you don't just harvest one, you harvest a lot of them. And then if it's successful and the mother is pregnant, the father's happy, there's some leftover embryos. And
Right.
what do you do with those? I mean, you commit murder according to Alabama law, as I
According
understand.
to Alabama law, well, it's interesting, after that ruling, the Alabama legislature did enact a law that was signed by the governor that said there will be no liability for the progenitors. They didn't use the word progenitor, but that's the people who gave tissue, eggs, and sperm to create the embryo, and no liability for the doctors if something happens to the embryos. So now they civil or criminal liability. So they basically saying, okay, we're going to protect the IVF doctors, we're going to protect the parents if something happens to the embryo. Then it's kind of on one level feckless. What's the point of making the ruling? The only real risk left is you have to store them cryogenically in perpetuity, which is not rational or reasonable. You're going to have divorce disputes about them. But no one will be sued or prosecuted if something happens to them. So I don't know. It's kind of gray where that goes. I do envision a lot of litigation about who gets them and what are you going to do with them.
So is there a way, or is there a solution whereby you could curb sort of an unnecessary destruction of an unnecessary number of embryos?
Sure. There's a lot of people who, for medical reasons, can't create an embryo and can't afford an egg donor or a sperm donor. So you could donate the embryos to another infertile couple for procreative purposes. Embryos can also be used to create embryonic stem cell lines. So, along the lines of people who take that cord blood tissue after a birth, and they use that cord blood for the future medical needs of a child, because the cord blood is an exact genetic match to the child. Embryonic stem cells are even better because they're nascent stem cells. You can train those stem cells to become anything. You can grow tissue to treat burn injuries. You can grow potentially organs. You can treat blood disorders, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, things like that. So oftentimes I counsel my clients, save those embryos at least until your children are 18. Now there's even medical research that shows, even though the embryo is just a half genetic match to a parent, those embryos can even be used to create embryonic stem cell lines that might even help treat a medical condition the parent has. So again, now you're going to piss off the religious right and say, oh, you're playing God. You can't take an embryo, which is a person, and then create an embryonic stem cell line, essentially killing the person to save another person. I don't know where it all goes in Alabama, but in California, and then, look at the CNN map. Pick a blue state, you can do it. Pick a red state, you can't do it probably. But there's a lot of things that you can do with those embryos besides just what we call discarding them.
So there's benefits. I mean, there's life benefits, saving someone else's life.
Right.
I mean,
and this is pre-implantation. So, there's this whole thing. I think, you even sent me an article from the New York Times today about what happens in the first 6 weeks of pregnancy.
Yeah.
If you don't implant that embryo, it's just an 8-cell entity. You take an egg. An egg is a single cell organism. A sperm is a single cell organism. You put them together, you've got two. Then you let it incubate in an IVF laboratory. It splits into 4. It splits into 8. And somewhere around day 3 to day 5, it's called a blastocyst. And then you freeze it. All right. It's still just cells. Nothing has developed. There's no spinal cord. There's no, dents for the ears. There's nothing. It's just cells. Mm-hmm. So as pre-implantation, you can still do a lot. And I don't think that that's a child. I think even in Alabama, it would be.
What was that the thing where if the well, hold on. If I'm driving and I have an embryo in my passenger seat.
If someone litigated that,
I know, that's what
in the carpool lane and she was pregnant.
Right, carpool lane. Right. Well, I get a ticket.
I 2 passengers, and the court said no. But I think in Alabama, you should be able, based on this ruling, to drive in the carpool lane if you're pregnant.
That's right.
So when you said that, a few questions to follow up. You said that Dobbs, or I'm sorry, that the IVF ruling is a backdoor way to get around abortion bans. Explain that for our viewers.
Well, before Dobbs came along, people were attacking IVF, making these same arguments that the Alabama Supreme Court weighed in on, saying embryos are people. Mm-hmm. A pregnant woman, let's say a surrogate, we're involved in surrogacy. A surrogate's carrying a child. The child has a constitutional right to have a relationship with the birth mother. So surrogacy is an abomination and it's against the Bible. They've argued that, embryos have constitutional rights of their own, like juridical people, like they say in Louisiana. Mm-hmm. If you remember the Sofia Vergara case with Nick Loeb, you remember originally the case was filed in LA. Mm-hmm. And then he moved the case to Louisiana. Why did he do that? Mm-hmm. Although jurisdiction was bullshit, he said, I once lived in Louisiana. But he went to Louisiana because then those frozen embryos had the right to their own lawyer. And then he had a much better chance of maybe prevailing against Sofia Vergara. The only reason he lost in Louisiana was because of jurisdiction. But had he actually been a resident of Louisiana, or had those embryos been in Louisiana, there's a good chance he could have won that case. Had he been in Arizona, after 2022, he'd win that case because Arizona enacted a law in 2022 that says if you have frozen embryos and you're going through a divorce and you're having a discussion about who gets them, the law now says whoever wants to use them to have a child and procreate gets them. Over the objection of the other person, they have no say.
So, Dean, what's the current litigation field out there with regard to abortion rights? I know in the Supreme Court they argued last week, I think it was, whether the interplay between EMTALA, which is the federal law that prohibits hospitals from dumping patients. When you mean dumping, they come in the emergency room, they don't have insurance, they're not well, and the hospital doesn't want to take them in to take care of them, and they have to stabilize them before discharging them. Whether the duty to stabilize a patient would also, in the medical judgment, create the necessity of performing a determination, whether it's
right.
DNC or something, and how that interplays with state abortion bans. And so I know about that interplay in the Supreme Court, but what's out there and what's going on right now?
Well, I think it depends on the state, obviously. But let's take your example for a minute. What if a woman has an ectopic pregnancy, meaning that the embryo didn't implant into the uterus, it got stuck in the fallopian tube? That's an emergency situation. The patient will die if it is not immediately removed from the fallopian tube, which means you are removing the embryo and for lack of a better word, terminating the embryo. Is that an abortion? It's not in the uterus. It doesn't necessarily require a DNC, but the embryo is deceased. The percentage is low, but you know, when you look in terms of surrogacy, there's probably, you know, just here in California, we probably do, I don't know, 6,000 surrogacy cases a year. If you go across the US, maybe, you know, 60 or 80,000 surrogacy cases a year. Statistically, every year there's going to be ectopic pregnancies. There's going to be medical conditions which indicate that the child is either going to die before birth or at birth, or have significant medical conditions which will severely impact the quality of life, whether it's Fragile X syndrome or dangling choroid or you know, spina bifida, whatever it is. And the courts are telling these people, you have to have this child, or you have to risk your life, you have to risk death because you can't have an abortion. And then there's just, you know, people who aren't doing surrogacy or third party reproduction, they're just pregnant, and their life circumstances are such that they cannot have a baby. There's, you know, there's already studies showing that the mortality rate is up. I saw a story about a woman who literally died in a waiting room at a hospital in some state. I don't remember which state. There's, you know, women are having to travel to the Western states, California, Washington, to get an abortion. And those places are booked. It's a mess.
Yes, you know, in South Carolina, we passed after the second go around, you know, a fetal heartbeat bill. You can call it 6 weeks, whatever you call it, but you know, there are exceptions. And I'm just going to address one right now, but yeah, I hired by a hospital system here in the state, and the OBGYNs who went to medical school to care for patients are literally frightened to death. I mean, they had a conference in Nashville of OBGYNs. There was some lawyer, I'm not going to say who she was, but she was advising all the OBGYNs who came to the conference, go back to your hospitals and tell them, I want a contract whereby if I go to jail, you have to pay my family while I'm in prison for doing the practice of medicine. I mean, that's how scared they are. And one of the exceptions in the South Carolina law is you can perform an abortion where there's a fetal anomaly, you know, life of the mother, life of the baby. Well, basically it's a non-viable fetus. And the language of fetal anomaly is, in a reasonable medical judgment, the unborn child has profound and irremediable congenital or chromosomal anomaly that without the provision of life-preserving treatment would be incompatible with sustaining life. I'm sorry, it says with or without the provision of life-preserving treatment. And so that language is so loaded with reasonable medical judgment and with or without the provision of life-preserving treatment. And I'll tell you, the standard of care for a woman who goes into, they don't even call it premature labor, but if it's less than 20 weeks of, you know, since they were pregnant, and the standard is that you don't, and you can't stop the pregnancy. You can't stop the pregnancy, then you terminate it, because and they can't say there's zero chance that a fetus of less than 20 weeks will survive. They can say there's probably a 90% chance it won't survive. So, you know, does that mean that and there are documented cases where they have a 19-week-old fetus and they put them on life support and they keep them alive, but it's no kind of life. And so these OBs are like, what do we do? And so they're having to, you know, document everything, but they're scared to death to perform any type of an abortion.
This woman, this lawyer that gave the advice, this is recent. This is post Roe v. Wade, right?
Oh yeah. This is in response to all these heartbeat bills out there.
Got it. So how do you advise your OBGYN clients? Like what?
Well, we're working through it. We're trying to work with the state to come up with a protocol that, you know, protects the doctors. I mean, what is reasonable medical judgment? And you know, medicine is part art, part science.
Yeah.
And you don't know if, I mean, is the judgment you got zero chance of survival, or is it you only have 80% chance of survival? So you got to take the 20% chance. And then if you're a hospital system, you put a 19 and a half week old fetus on life support and you keep it alive for a year, you've just spent probably $6 million of, and the child doesn't have have zero chance to have a life. And so, but can you come up with a scenario where you can keep pre 20-week-old fetuses alive? Yeah, you can. I mean, science is developing every day, and so who knows? But it's very troubling. And then you have rape and incest, and you have these doctors are having to report when someone comes in and says, I was raped, and they have to report the rape. The doctor has to report the abortion, and they're then interrogated by the police officers coming in. Oh, so you performed an abortion, and they take a report, and I mean they feel like they're under investigation, and so
they're at risk. It's interesting that I'm seeing
they're very reluctant. They're very reluctant to perform the work that they were trained to do when they went to med school.
I've heard that there's been not a significant, but I don't know how significant exodus of OBGYNs from certain states just leaving the state. I've also heard that there's a number of med students who are no longer going into obstetrics and gynecology. They're like, forget it. I'm not going to go down that road. They just train for a different specialty. So what's going to happen in 15 or 20 years in Alabama? You're going to have a lot of kids with birth defects, life support, no OBs, no obstetricians. I think the long-term ramifications are dubious.
And believe me, we in South Carolina, in the rural areas, we have a very, very, very significant shortage of OB/GYNs to provide prenatal care. And as you're right, it's only going to get worse and worse because of the fear factor that's involved. And in the state legislature in South Carolina takes this model act and they dress it up with, language that it's not medical language, and it's not, and it's just exposes physicians to being second guessed, and it's going to come from, and I've seen it all throughout my career. You have a disgruntled co-employee in the operating room, co-employee in the ER and whatever, and they're reporting, oh, Dr. So-and-so performed an abortion and it really wasn't necessary. I mean, that's where it comes from. It comes from within, because Dr. So-and-so just chewed out nurse so-and-so or whomever, and it's payback time. And that's right.
And to your point, that Supreme Court case that was argued last week, that's based on, I think, an Idaho law, if I'm not mistaken. And in that case, the court, for religious reasons similar to Alabama, ignored most of the current studies and medical opinions, and rested its opinion on a 25-year-old study that's since been abandoned and not considered valid anymore. And that's the case that goes up to the Supreme Court, where it becomes, kind of an abuse of discretion thing. Was there an error? It's an agenda-driven situation. It's just political now. Everything's political. It's not based on science. It's not based on medical opinions. And the victims will be women, and women who need to make reproductive choices and decisions, and women whose lives can be at risk, and doctors who are just going to say, forget it.
But also when it pours into on the IVF side, it's not just women. It's, millions of families who can't have a family, couples that can't have a family, or, gays who, two dads who can't get pregnant. So
I'm waiting for the Alabama Supreme Court to refine its ruling and say embryos made by heterosexual couples are kids, but if it's two gay men, you could throw it out. It's fine with us. Right. So eventually these cases are going to come along.
That's interesting. Like, it's murder if it's
against the Bible. Gay embryo, you can toss those.
Right. But if it's an embryo that belongs to a gay couple that they had a surrogate or whatever, that right? then
Right.
that is not murder. God,
Right.
God.
Yeah, I'll throw out. I was at a conference in D.C. a while back on this. That a lot of lawyers around the country. It was the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, and we were all, addressing what to do, how to advise our clients, and one another significant issue is, and a lot of states say that you cannot prosecute the mother for leaving the state to go have an abortion, but the guy who drives her across state lines, yeah, he gets prosecuted. Well, what about the doctor who says, I can't perform an abortion here, but I can refer you to Connecticut where you can get an
Well,
abortion,
that happens in Texas. That's the law in Texas. Typically our surrogate contracts say, a woman has the right to choose, but the surrogate is um, relegating or delegating her right to decide to the intended parents who are the owners of those embryos. And if there's something significantly wrong with the child, and they ask her to abort, that she'll abort. We can't put that language in any contract in Texas because that would be violative of the law that says you cannot do anything to encourage someone to get an abortion. If the surrogate needs to leave Texas, we can't put that in the contract. If someone is going to escort her from Texas to a clinic, we can't put that in a contract. And certainly, we don't want to have a very nebulous contract where we have no idea what's going to happen if something's wrong with the baby. So again, we just don't go to Texas unless we have IPs and a surrogate who are all pro-life people and they are happy to abide by those statutes. That's the only time or the only exception I would make to do surrogacy in Texas. We go to all the states. We do surrogacy across the U.S. So you can have the lawyer in California, the agencies in Washington, the surrogates in Texas, the IPs live in New Jersey, and everybody comes together and we create this process.
Dean, when you look for a surrogate, when you try to recruit a surrogate for your client or whatever, you do that.
I
right?
don't do that for.
Oh,
so there's surrogate agencies. There's agencies or
okay.
match.
So do these agencies delve into the political and religious beliefs of the candidates?
Yeah, we do deeply, especially we have basically the protocol is, besides doing a medical screening to make sure the surrogate is capable of carrying a healthy pregnancy and getting pregnant, we do a whole psychological analysis. There's a psychologist involved. She speaks to the intended parents. She does a full screening of the surrogate. It's an MMPI, a personal meeting, and a discussion of those issues because this woman is carrying a child for other people. She has to hand that child over. She has to still take care of herself and care for the baby. We have to make sure it's not just simply motivated by money.
Yeah.
And they do delve into the religious part and what happens if there's something wrong with the baby. How do you feel about abortion? Things like that. And basically, that's part of the match. Like, you're not a good match for this couple. We're not going to match a pro-life surrogate with a pro-choice gay couple from San Francisco.
Or you may not be a good candidate at all, not even just a match, right?
No, because if she passes the screening on all other parts, she could be matched with a pro-life set of IPs from a conservative state.
Wow.
So
it's like dating site, it's almost like doesn't mean someone is not compatible to date. They just have to find the right partner.
Well, if someone's on a dating app, they're pretty much incompatible. They're not good for dating. Let me ask you this: you mentioned we don't go here, we go here for IVF. So, has this Alabama decision impacted clinics and doctors that perform IVF services outside of Alabama? Are people just on guard and are steering away from these services in certain states, or you don't really see its impact outside of Alabama?
It's kind of like throwing a rock into a pond and seeing the ripples. So the very close neighboring states to Alabama are on guard and are concerned. The ripple doesn't really reach past the Rockies. No one's really thinking about it out here on the West Coast, except to say, come out to the West Coast and your rights will be protected.
And I mean, California, it's abortions are legal, I guess up until viability, right? That's
Yeah,
the
and I'm no, you know, yeah, they
yeah.
are technically, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I'm you know to say personally, I think that there's a reasonable limit to abortions.
Right.
You'll know really at 17 weeks if there's any significant problem with the fetus, where you chorionic villus sampling, amnios, you know, the level of testing that currently exists with technology, you should know between 15 and 17 weeks, which is second trimester.
Right.
Um, Doctors as a practice, even though the law says one thing, doctors as a practice in California are not going to do a third trimester abortion. Um, and they're not going to do it unless there's a medical necessity, a real significant problem with the fetus or a threat to the life of the birth mother.
Right, which makes sense, right? But what was I saying? Okay. So when people come to California, for example, to do abortions now, aside from the liability issue of the referring physician and whatnot, how are people making their way to a state like California for abortions as an alternative to their state where it's banned? Are people just finding their own sort of alternative here and finding a doctor here? Or is there like, do we now have intermediary service providers that these people can go to find an, out of
Kind of
state?
like abortion tourism, like people go to
Yeah,
Colombia for Brazilian
yeah,
butt lift, and now they come to California for an abortion. I
exactly.
don't know. Um, you have to be really careful. I have heard of some people putting in their contracts that if an abortion is necessary, and I use the term necessary, you know, under the circumstances that we've been discussing, that, you know, the intended parents will bear the extra travel expense for the surrogate to travel to an abortion friendly state. Um, Typically, intended parents pay for everything. So they pay for all the tests, they pay for parking, mileage, airfare, you know, prenatal vitamins, deductibles, co-payments. You know, the surrogate is never responsible to be out a penny. So they pay all the expenses and they pay a fee for the pain and suffering and inconvenience of carrying a pregnancy for them.
Mhm.
So that's an added expense now that some people are putting in the contract, that if it's necessary to travel, they will pay that expense. Now you have to be careful how you word that in certain states, because you don't want to be seen as encouraging abortion. We haven't put that in our contracts because we have enough business where we just say, no, I'm not sending you to that state. We'll find you a different match from a different state.
Yeah, but I think at some point in the future, soon to be future, we're going to end up with those back alley, dangerous abortion procedures for women that want to get an abortion or need to get an abortion, that where it's banned in their state and don't have the financial means to
Right.
travel.
Now, that's not an art issue
No,
or a
no,
surgery
it's not an art
issue.
issue.
That's a general pop issue.
Correct.
Yeah, and I think you're already seeing that. I think
Yeah.
you're already seeing an increase in bad outcomes, pregnancy outcomes, and deaths, and people who are stuck. There was a case where a woman was pregnant with triplets and wanted a reduction just to twins, because a triplet pregnancy is a very high risk pregnancy for the babies. They're going to be born at maybe 30, 32 weeks. They're going to have to go into NICU. The medical bills are going to be hundreds of thousands of dollars. There's the surrogate's going to be on bed rest at about 26 weeks. They're going to have to stop working. She's going to have a C-section. It's a really complicated pregnancy, and we want to stay away from triple pregnancies. So she wanted a reduction, which is an abortion. You're reducing the pregnancy, as long as they're all in different sacs, from 3 to 2. That was refused. And the babies all have significant medical issues already. I mean, this was recent, because the laws in Texas are more than a year old. So now you're already seeing those results. Their lungs were underdeveloped. They had hypercephalus, which is an enlarged skull. They might have neurological developmental issues. because she had no choice. She couldn't afford to leave, couldn't get the reduction. And, that's the kind of shit you're going to see happen.
You got a
You know,
camp? You got a camp? What's that?
Most of the abortions now are done by, taking medication, right? And so I promise you, we're going to see black market. What's it called? Mifepristone or what? I don't know if that's pronounced.
Morning after.
No,
yeah,
no.
But that's not really an option. In the example I give you with triplets, first she knew she was pregnant, but she didn't find out until about 8 weeks that there were actually 3 sacs. You cannot take mifepristone for a triplet pregnancy at 8 weeks. That's not an option for her.
Right. But I mean, that is different than the morning after pill, which is over the counter. I mean, this isn't induces termination of pregnancy. But I'm telling you, there's going to be a black market. It probably already is a black market out there.
Jim, how
the Supreme Court's going to rule on that too. What's the Supreme Court going to say? Is that drug, which is recognized and been around for decades and recognized by the FDA as a good drug, is the Supreme Court going to take it away? Because that case is coming up.
Yeah. So the issue there, and there's litigation. You're right, and it's coming up that what's been fought out at the appellate levels across the country in federal court is how is it administered? Can you administer it remotely? Like, can you have telemedicine, a prescriber in an abortion friendly state send it to someone ordering it in a place where it's not permitted? And FDA rules initially were it had to be on-site provider, had to be there with a patient, and now they've relaxed those. And so
yeah, but you might have some issues with the doctor. Telehealth, at least as I understand it, the person providing the telehealth has to be licensed in the state where the patient is. I don't think you could have a California doctor giving a prescription to a resident of Texas. And I don't think the FDA has the jurisdiction to change that rule. I don't know. I'm not an expert on that, but I don't think a California doctor is going to want to take the risk of doing that anyway.
No, I don't think they will either. But that's that's being litigated. The morning after pill is over the counter. I think that's available everywhere, isn't it? I'm not sure, but
almost like using a condom, though. You had unprotected sex, and then the next day you take one as a precaution. You don't even know,
Right. But Jim, the abortion pill, not the morning after pill, how up until what point does that pill work to terminate a pregnancy? Do you know?
That's my understanding. I don't know the answer to that, but the majority of the terminations are
chemical.
Chemical induced. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, but I mean, is it like, so there's no threshold, like it'll work on during the first trimester and the second trimester? And
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
Definitely first trimester.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. But I was wondering if it's.
I would have to imagine. I don't think the problem is it probably could work in the second trimester, but you'd still have to do a dilation and curettage, which is the DNC, because there's too much tissue in there. So that has to be, evacuated. So
right.
At a 6-week level, there's really no tissue. You can, it'll be like passing a small blood clot.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't be able to do it. It would kill the pregnancy, it'd kill the baby, but you'd still have to undergo a procedure.
Right. Okay, so just briefly, because this is election year, and this is obviously a very, very important issue, abortion and IVF. And I think the implications of the ban in Florida today, it goes into effect, goes well beyond that state. And so Kamala Harris is going to be in Florida. We're recording this episode on May 1st. Kamala Harris is going to be in Florida today. Because I think the Democrats really believe that if Biden wins the election, it's because of his stance on this issue, on abortion. Trump, on the other hand, has completely really tried hard to get away from the issue altogether. And he sort of speaks from, both sides. He says, what did he say? He said that
Yes, you're welcome. It's because of me. And I don't really, I think 15 weeks is fine.
right. He says we leave it to the states to decide. But then he says, remember what's in your heart, but remember we must always win. It's like, what? So that's where he's coming from. And then I was saying to you, Dean, in our pre-interview call, that Biden has been repeatedly saying that him and the VP are determined to put a bill before Congress to bring back, essentially codify Roe v. Wade, because of the Dobbs decision. And you said that's a terrible idea.
Well, not quite. When we were talking about a federal rule regarding whether embryos are people. And that would be a nightmare that I don't want. If they want to codify Roe v. Wade, I'm fine with that.
So, you're okay with that? You think that's
okay
a good solution?
because I feel that a woman's reproductive rights are her choice, and she should have a right to choose. And even if you put a reasonable guideline on it, 15 weeks, I'm fine with that. Mm-hmm. I think do I want the federal government to come in and make a determination or a finding that embryos are people, whether it's pre-implantation or while they're sitting in a cryo tank or when they've just been implanted? Are embryos juridical people? Are they, is there such a thing as fetal personhood? Do they have rights? I don't want the federal government weighing in on that, because it's not going to be based on a medical decision. It's not going to be based on medical data. It's going to be based on politics and religion. It's going to be a fucking nightmare.
Yeah, right. But a codification of Roe v. Wade, I think, is a good idea, right?
I don't have any problem with that as long as it's based on just reproductive right to decide what to do with your body.
What is Jim? What is South Carolina? I mean, that's a red state. Where are you guys at on this issue, given the elections are coming up?
I mean, it's a red state.
Should we ask Dick Harpootlian?
Yeah, we just passed the fetal heartbeat bill. I mean, what are you talking about? Where are we on this issue? If you live in a state like South Carolina, I mean, your vote really doesn't matter when it comes to the presidential election, because it's already decided. And it's like
we say in California. What's the point?
Yeah, it's exactly. What's the point in California? So it all come down to a handful of states. And I did hear some polling today on the news show that the abortion issue is pretty low on the things that people are ranking that they care most about when going to the polls. I mean, it's the inflation. It's
really?
Oh yes, it's affordable housing. It's all the economics. I mean, now will it make a difference in turnout and make a difference? Because you're only talking about 50,000 votes in these swing states. So I mean, the margin.
I'm curious, what news outlet was saying that it's financial and not abortion?
CNN.
Well,
Clinton News Network. Yeah.
Yeah.
Clinton News Network.
That's what they used to call it here. Yeah, the Clinton News Network.
Clinton News Network. Although, yeah, it's dead anyway. Whatever it is. So, Dean, how do people find you? Because you are the authority in this area, and you've helped so many people. So obviously, people should be able to find you readily. Do they go to your website? Where do they go?
Yeah, I mean, you could, if you Google me, you'll find me. The website is vmfirm.com. It's V like Victor, M like Mary, FIRM, with my name, or, just Google it. It'll pop up. I mean, there's enough stuff in the news or by name that you'll get to the website.
Okay, great. So, Dean, thank you for joining us. And you can find us on all platforms where you listen to your podcast. And obviously, if you're visual like us, you can find us on YouTube. And thank you for joining us on this very important conversation.
Thanks, Dean.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Nice to meet you, Jim.